Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Back going to talk about playing safe in Mythic Plus, specifically in those kind of grievous or bursting weeks, which can be so annoying to deal with. All right, starting it off, there are two legit builds that are going to be out there for Mythic Plus, and some little variations that are going to be in between. Primarily, the more aggressive build is going to run Schism and Solace and Sins of the Many, while the more defensive build is going to be running Twist of Fate, Solace, or Mindbender, which we'll talk about, and Shadow Covenant. All right. With these talents in mind, the goals of them are going to be a little bit different. They both are going to be very competitive, and you'll probably see some slight iterations on them. Say if you want to play in between safe and aggressive, you might take like Twist of Fate and Sins of the Many at the same time to be able to have that little bit of an in-between build. But playing safe, and I know a lot of people have been asking about this, will reduce your damage significantly in the dungeon, but you still will contribute a large margin, as you'll be able to see from some of the footage here, by taking, more damage dealing Azerite traits, by making sure that you're playing in putting up your Shadow Pains very aggressively at the start of multiple pulls. Different things like that can help you eke out still a very substantial amount of damage, especially compared to other healers, while still being able to keep everybody alive. All right, big areas that you want to be using a safer build. For me, a lot of times whenever I'm running keys, I know it's going to be, for example, a very high key. I know that I'm not too familiar with the dungeon, or if the affixes are very rough this week. So for example, a Grievous week is very painful. Dungeons that specifically have more AoE, more group-wide damage, like a Taldazar, for example, has a lot of threats out there and a lot of ways to be able to apply Grievous to multiple targets. If you have high trash density dungeon with many low health mobs, kind of like in the Motherlode, for example, Bursting Week can be quite deadly there, right? Different scenarios that are going out, and honestly, if you're just starting out, I would definitely recommend starting with a safer orientation, a safer build, as you get familiar with your group, as you get familiar with the content that you're going to be running, and then start becoming more aggressive, then start working on maximizing your damage further through your talents and playstyle after that point, right? But playing safe, the reason you're going to be taking Twist of Fate is going to be providing that sort of bounce back mechanic to be able to, not only improve your damage, but also be able to improve your Shadow Mend healing, because that is usually going to be the source that you have to lean on whenever the tank is just taking very heavy hits. Depending on which tank that you're running with, for example, a Brought Paladin will need a little bit more support than a Blood DK, especially with how they operate and are often more incentivized to sit into melee, continue to tank damage, continue to deal a lot of damage, but they will need a lot more support than, say, a Blood DK would as well. So in that scenario, you need to make sure you have Twist of Fate if they're expecting to take very heavy hits, and you want to be able to help bounce them back. A Shadow Covenant is a very strong healing ability with a price attached to it. You do have to worry about half of the healing that you do coming back as an absorption effect. Many times we will try to deal with that as the end punch, and the way to really use Shadow Covenant to the best extent is to try to make it the last punch of healing that you need to clear Grievous stacks or to keep everybody alive after a pull from Bursting, right? Once everybody's in that comfortable scenario, then you're going to have that 5-second to 6-second duration of the Shadow Covenant debuff, and if you don't need any other healing after a pull from Bursting, or you've already cleared the Grievous stacks from a number of different players all at once, then it's not a high price to pay to deal with that extra debuff. When you have to deal with just the debuff healing and not 4 or 5 Grievous stacks, it's a very small price to pay in that regard. Other encounters have been in Tyrannical, for example. Tyrannical Galvas, when we were running 15 or 16 level Temple of Sethralus, the third boss in that dungeon has extremely high damage going out. And at that point, you really can't fight up against the debuff of it. You kind of have to, or play around the debuff, I guess is the best way to say it. You just have to use it on cooldown because it's going to offer the highest throughput to be able to keep everybody alive, right? It does have very strong synergy with Twist of Fate and, of course, with your Mastery. So ideally, you want to be able to take advantage of both by having Powered Radiance already out and Atonements out onto the entire party, dealing as much damage as you can, and then as you start pumping up everybody, you start becoming a little bit closer to getting everybody topped off, especially if you have something like Mindbender, for example, where you Powered Radiance, Mindbender, and everybody's just about to be topped off, rather than casting 4 or 5 individual Shadow Mends to get everybody in your group topped off. You just have that punch of Shadow Covenant where everybody's topped, and then you're able to continue smiting, continue dealing damage, and getting through the instance more rapidly, right? safe play in Mythic Plus is always going to revolve around, watching your tank. So a lot of times when I go into pulls, I'll just put a shield onto the tank and then start dotting up about 4 to 6 mobs whenever it's going to be relevant, and I know that they're going to live long enough to get that full duration. This is always going to be important, not only to be able to get damage out, get trickle healing into the tank from the start, but also get the Power of the Dark Side procs, because while Penance defensively is quite weak just by itself, if you're having a Power of the Dark Side proc going out, it can be extremely helpful, especially if any of the packs are requiring higher mobility. As you see a lot of times when we're running into a Taldazar, for example, in the more undead wing of the dungeon, there's a lot of mobility required. So being able to spam cast Shadowmans, then lean on a Power of the Dark Side empowered Penance while you're moving and repositioning is extremely helpful when you're spot healing and focusing into the tank. Or if everybody's at a pretty decent level and you're able to use it offensively, then that makes it a lot easier to be able to top the entire group off with that final punch from Shadow Covenant going out there. You will see a lot of variance between the safe and more aggressive builds. While there is going to be that price to pay with Shadow Covenant, it's an extremely strong tool to be able to play safe, but you have to make sure that you're making proper effectiveness of it by clearing those Grievous stacks when you need to, and not constantly battling against both the Grievous ticks and the healing debuff that's going to be associated with it. Because it may not be a big deal if you're outside of a Grievous week and you say, oh, it's fine just leaving somebody at 70 or 80% HP, I'll go heal them after their debuff falls off, because 5 seconds isn't a long period of time. But with Grievous, if you ignore that person, then they're going to get increasing levels of Grievous stacks, and you're going to continually have to fight up against it. So when you use it, you need to make sure that you're making the best usage of it, and clearing Grievous stacks or getting people to a healthy enough level to finish the pull, then they can eat, they can regain their HP, and then you can move on from there, right? Always keeping in mind that sometimes it is worth paying that price, and other times you have to be doing whatever you can to try to avoid it and to try to dodge it, because a lot of times when you can get away with it, you're doing a huge amount of healing with no other cost attached to it. You're able to have a hefty mobile heal that synergizes with Twist of Fate and your Mastery to be able to get your entire group topped off or in a healthy enough position, right? Keeping in mind, once you want to start playing more aggressively, we'll definitely be covering this in more of the Mythic Plus pushing guides that you'll see in the future. But once you start playing more aggressively, you can go to something like Twist of Fate and Sins to be able to have that kind of balance between spot healing when you need to and damage over the rest of the instance. And then finally going into Schism and Sins to be able to really pump out a very huge amount of damage. You will end up taking Mindbender in a safer build to kind of have that 1 minute burst of damage to be able to help top everybody off a little bit more consistently. But you will get better damage results out of Shadow Fiend and Solace together. So keeping in mind, a lot of the big dangerous pulls that you're going to be going into, if you're able to have that consistent healing every single time, especially if you're doing lots of smaller pulls rather than 1 or 2 really big pulls over the course of the instance that you'll always be able to have a Shadow Fiend for. If you're having lots of smaller ones, then you're definitely going to get a lot of value and safety out of running with something like Mindbender. But like I said, keep in mind the distinction between playing safe and playing high damage, right? When you start seeing really high level key groups that are running and streaming, for example, if you want to check out my stream, link in the description below, you will see people playing a lot more aggressively, and it's because they have that familiarity with their group, because they have that familiarity with the instance, because they plugged in their dungeon into Method Dungeon tools and know every single pull that they're going to do before they do it, right? Keeping in mind that difference is going to be out there. Just because you're seeing one build does not mean it's going to be one size fits all for everybody, all right? Going into Azerite traits as well, because I know we've been getting a couple of those questions on what you would primarily want to be running with. In terms of a safe build, Archive is a very powerful trait to be able to run with because it does have that nice synergy of damage and healing available to you, because it's just straight up intellect increase. Something along the lines of Depth of Shadows can be pretty valuable, but you have to keep in mind that it's not always that you will lose out on some of the damage if you ran with something like Archive instead. So my recommendation to be able to have kind of straddle between playing aggressively and defensively, Archive is an excellent choice to be able to go after if you can get them. And then once you start gearing up and progressing through those dungeons, you'll be looking towards pure damage traits, which, keep in mind, those damage traits do not proc atonement, but going after those damage traits to be able to pump out even more damage to help the dungeon go that much more quickly. So, me know what you guys think, and if you have any other questions on safe or even aggressive play in Mythic Plus, we'll have another video dedicated to just aggressive play in the future. But for now, I wanted to make sure we laid out what is important when you're trying to get into dungeons, especially in affixes that are more dangerous and, you know, more painful to deal with as Disciplined Priest. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Hope you all found it useful. I'll catch y'all next time.